History.
We shall never surrender.
Politics.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony.
Current affairs.
Going to Pizza Express in Woking is an unusual thing for me to do.
Conspiracies.
Ask not what your country can do for you.
We'll stop terrorists from coming after us.
I just received a beautiful letter from Kim Jong-un.
It concludes that Iraq has chemical and biological weapons.
I'm not guilty of harassing anyone.
Well, I'm not a crook.
This is the Political Darkside Podcast. And now, here's your host, Matthew Howland.
If you only knew the power of the dark side.
Welcome to episode 9 of the Political Darkside podcast. I just wanted to do a quick introduction to let you all know I've changed the funding system for the podcast. So if anyone wants to help me pay for this thing, it's on buymeacoffee.com/pdarksidepod. It should be just at the bottom of the screen there. If you want to chuck me a couple of pound each month or donate to something to help me pay for the internet bills and the books and whatnot, that would be phenomenal. Also, if everyone could go here, linktr.ee/politicaldarkside and join the Instagram and the Twitter, that would be really helpful for me to help get the numbers up. And this episode is going to be with Aaron Good talking about the JFK assassination. I've kind of been trying to work out what this podcast is since I started, and I've decided it's basically like an introductory thing to various topics. You know, it's difficult for me to find the balance between taking these topics in depth and treating them as brand new topics for myself, because obviously I've spent X amount of time reading up on these things. So what I like to do, what I'm trying to do, is essentially introduce everyone listening to these new topics, so that hopefully you'll find interest in it and go digging yourself for a little bit more information if you're interested in such things. If not, that's fine, I suppose. I've got a couple of other episodes lined up, so hopefully they'll be recording soon. In the meantime, enjoy this episode. Thanks.
I am talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and build a better life for their children. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women. Not merely peace in our time, but peace in all time.
Aaron Good joins me today on the Political Darkside podcast. Aaron is the host of the American Exception podcast and has an upcoming book entitled American Exception, Empire and the Deep State. Aaron recently appeared on Oliver Stone's newest documentary, Destiny Betrayed, which is a fascinating update 30 years later to Stone's film JFK. Aaron's been kind enough to join me here to talk about the Kennedy assassination. So Aaron, how are you, sir?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks for joining me. So when I was 12 years old at school, we did a history project about the assassination of JFK, and that was my introduction to the event. It was quite basic, but in retrospect, it's kind of remarkable that a school curriculum would teach it as a potential conspiracy theory, given where we are now in this post-truth censored speech era. So for context, it was in the year 2000, so it predated 9/11. I believe you're slightly older than me, so can you pinpoint your initial interest in JFK?
Probably, I guess, seeing the film JFK. I mean, I had known, I guess my dad had told me, my mom and my dad both had told me about when JFK had been killed. And I was really, my mother worked in politics, and so I was really kind of interested in politics from an early age. But I didn't really know. I knew that the Vietnam War was bad, and so on, because my mom was anti-war when she was in college, and then she worked for Vietnam vets for this congressman, trying to get them benefits, especially like PTSD, disability benefits. They couldn't work after Vietnam. And so I went to my friend's parents. I stayed over at a friend's house, and we all went to go see the movie JFK in the theater. And I would have been like 13 or so, and I was totally riveted by it. I thought like it was like, because it's a very well done movie just from a movie making angle, and then the history part of it was very interesting. And the fact that they were talking about how he was trying to get out of Vietnam, I thought, oh yeah, well, this all makes sense, because if we would go, why did we fight that war? We were killing so many people that were so poor and not any possible threat to us. Like there's some sort of evil in this system that would do that. And so it seemed plausible to me at the time that it would have been Kennedy, that he would have been killed in an assassination or in a conspiracy from the state, the same people that would launch that war. But I did, before that, I knew that Oswald was a lone nut, but some people think he didn't do it. And then he got killed by another lone nut, and that only made it seem more mysterious to people. Like I at least had that idea going in, but that was about it. So I saw the film, and it made an impact on me. And I pretty much thought it had to be true, or it was mostly true, or it couldn't be a lone nut and another lone nut. Like that couldn't really be true. But I didn't really think about it so much. I didn't spend that much time reading about it or researching it. And then I majored in political science. I spent a year in Taiwan. I came back and worked a bunch of different jobs, including on political campaigns. Finally, I worked for Obama's campaign in 2008. And after Obama was elected, and I was very excited about that, went to the inauguration and everything, the inaugural ball, the staff ball. And with the first thing that happened that made me think, oh man, this is some sort of regime that doesn't seem to matter who's in power here, was the coup in Honduras, the 2009 coup in Honduras, Honduras was like the original banana republic. Sam Zamuri set up in like 1912. He overthrew the government there with a mobster and a mercenary, and he bribed some Hondurans, and they put in it was a banana republic. And then we're doing it again in 2009. Well, this is horrendous, and Hillary Clinton's there trying, working to make sure that the coup is successful. And I thought, this is messed up. And around the same time, I saw Oliver Stone on Bill Maher talking about this book, JFK and the Unspeakable. And I thought, well, I should order that book. So I did, and then I read it, and this really, I thought, oh yeah, okay, this is the regime that we live under. And this is why it doesn't really matter getting Obama. And I felt like there was some self-delusion, I think, in working for Obama, because it's like a job, and it seems like, okay, this is a good team to be a part of. And I understand why people want to have political partisanship and so on. They want to think that there's like some rooting interest, some side, some ability to do something within the structures that actually exist. And so it's like, it's very it's seductive in that kind of way. But after, and with Libya, it was even more obvious. With Libya, I knew right away that it was like something that it was really, really awful. And at that point, I just started researching all the dark side of the national security state and the sort of state criminality. And I befriended a professor named Lance DeHaven Smith, Florida State, a retired professor who wrote about these issues, called them State Crimes Against Democracy. And I went to grad school, and I got a PhD in this area, which was a challenge because it's outside of the mainstream. But it made me have to be very careful as a scholar and very precise with my arguments and so on. So it was really cool in that way.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable that you've gone from being so into the Obama campaign that you're at the inaugural ball to you've gone completely the opposite way and kind of lumped him in with the security state. It's like you say, it's you got excited about him as a candidate, clearly. And I think still within the structures of the system, there's room for that. I mean, people were clearly excited about Donald Trump as well, but probably coming from the opposite direction. Even though he did probably point out the same issues that Obama was at least pointing out, but then they both went on to continue wars anyway. So
Trump was actually less. I mean, he didn't launch any new wars, at least by and large. I mean, I'm not. He's pretty horrific, but he at least had the sense that the Americans that it didn't help him politically to have these endless wars, and so I think that that's one of the things that they actually didn't like about him was that he wasn't useful to help them sell wars because he's kind of crass. He's not good for PR purposes. If you want to launch a war, he can't make it seem like it's a good thing to do. So, but yeah,
that's a good way. I've never considered that before. I mean, I suppose that's one of the ironies of people not liking him from the left, is that actually he was up there saying we shouldn't have wars.
Yeah, he said a lot of things, though. He said a lot of things that sounded sort of populist, and then ended up like he didn't do anything.
Yeah, that's very much true. So you have a good relationship with Oliver Stone, and you appeared on the Destiny Betrayed documentary. Have you seen it yet?
I have not seen the 4-hour version yet.
Okay.
So I know that I have something of a cameo in it. I think I'm more in the book because I talked more about C. Wright Mills and the power elite. It's the relationship between like Mills' thinking and the Eisenhower farewell address, and I talked about the CIA's origins, their sort of Wall Street origins, and so on. So I was wondering if those had made it, but I don't think those made the cut. But they will be in the book that Jim D'Eugenio is putting out, based on the interviews. Yeah, but yeah, I haven't seen it yet, and I love the 2-hour one. And I'm excited about the 4-hour one. I heard it may actually come out on Showtime and not just on like Amazon rental, but I'm not really sure in the US. It's very strange that in the US, where it would have the biggest market, that they haven't been able to get a solid distribution deal. I mean, I think that really says something.
Yeah, I mean, it's currently on Sky. For anyone in the UK that wants to see it, I highly recommend it. It seems that Oliver is now at the forefront of the search for truth on the Kennedy assassination. I mean, he's possibly at the forefront of the search for truth about the last 100 years of history. Do you feel like his work has become the consensus conspiracy theory, by which I mean the elements that he has put together are the strongest argument against the Warren Commission, the magic bullet, the lone gunman historical records?
Well, yes, but I would say that, and I'm not. This isn't like aimed at you exactly, but people have said this since his movie came out. They would refer to the idea that it was the national security state that eliminated John Kennedy for imperialist reasons. That they would call that like the Oliver Stone theory, as a way, I think, as a way to kind of delegitimize it and to really it's like they put it into the personage of Oliver Stone, because they have spent so much time calling him like a paranoid, irresponsible person, that's the way to say it. But Oliver himself would say that like this, he's building off the work of these other researchers. He's not like really the JFK guy or he's not even really a JFK guy. If you've known other JFK guys like like Jim D'Eugenio or John Newman or Peter Dale Scott, although Peter Dale Scott is maybe more broad, but like these people that have really spent all of their lives on it. So yeah, I do think that it seems to be that there's a lot of other theories that are out there. The vast majority of the books, though, I think Michael Parenti looked at these back in the day, or at least he cited a study that somebody else had done. And there were thousands of books written on the Kennedy assassination, and the vast majority of them posited a conspiracy involving an operation from the national security state. So this is kind of the consensus view, more or less, with like minor disagreements about this or that. People disagree over Garrison and whether he was really on to anything or not. But like by and large, the Russian side, nobody credible thinks it was a Russian plot. Nobody serious thinks that it was Castro at this point. There's really no case to be made for it being. I mean, I don't even think there's a case for the lone nut anymore. It's like, as you see with the new film, it's so every element of it is completely easily knocked down.
Yeah, I mean, Oliver's certainly consolidated all the best work, and he has the platform to put it out there. Except, like you say, for whatever reason in the US, it's not been put out there. Which there's something strange, obviously, going on with the way Rogan's been attacked and whatnot, and Oliver's recently appeared on there as well. So it's he does get a lot of crap. I mean, the Rogan thing, the timing of the Rogan thing is interesting because he did just have Oliver Stone on there, and it's I think that they really don't like Rogan's independence. Rogan is kind of a mixed bag for me, but
appreciate it that he has people like Oliver on. He has Abby Martin on in the past. I've seen Cornell on there. I only really watch him if it's a very small number of times I've seen him, but when I've seen him, it's when he has somebody on there I want to watch. And then I think like, oh, he seems like a decent guy. He has other people on there like Jordan Peterson and such that I just have no use for. But the way they're coming after him, I think is because, I mean, it's not that, oh, he said things that weren't true, but let me look at the litany of things that the corporate media has lied about in the last, I mean, really in the whole Cold War, but in the last 20 years, especially like weapons of mass destruction, everything involving Syria, everything involving Ukraine, they lie about all the time. They never point out that this whole situation is born of the U.S. overthrowing the government in Ukraine under Obama. I mean, this is like the start of the whole thing, and they just pretend that didn't happen. They just say that Putin invaded Crimea, invaded the Ukraine to steal Crimea, and just like kind of like Hitler did.
Yeah,
that's like the gist of it.
They conveniently leave out the far right elements that the US introduced into the Ukrainian government.
And the woman on tape, the US ambassador, or was it I think it's Victoria Nuland, right? And she's saying, yeah, Yats, put Yats in. Yats is our man. So she's like basically saying like which puppet dictator to put in. And she's on tape. Like it's not like she can even deny it. They were caught red-handed in this coup, and the whole US corporate media, and I guess it's probably over in Britain, they all do what America says too. So it's probably the same over there. They just pretend that just didn't happen because it's inconvenient. So just going to put it in the memory hole.
Yeah, we have the added excitement of occasionally having to scramble jets because some Russian jets have got close to our airspace or something. So they're always flying over my house, and it's nonsense, obviously.
I mean, the nuclear thing means Russia can't, even if Putin wanted to be Hitler, he couldn't be because of like nukes. They can't come and like take over all of Western Europe. So like it's just such a farce.
Yeah, it's a tangent anyway.
Yeah.
There's back to JFK. I mean, there's many elements of the assassination that are questionable. That there's so many that they almost lose their individual potency due to almost like an oversaturation of parts of this whole thing that are just nonsense. I mean, it firmly points to the fact that the official story is nonsense. I mean, I'd urge people to look into all those elements, the what, where, who, when, and how, but I'd like to focus a little on the why. I mean, why JFK was killed in the geopolitical context at the time. It becomes obvious following World War I that there was money to be made from organized war. I believe there were several war profiteering trials in the 1920s, possibly. And of course, we see similar profits made during World War II, culminating in President Eisenhower's infamous military-industrial complex speech. One major potential theater of conflict that the United States is dipping its toe into is Vietnam. Can you speak to why Kennedy's Vietnam policy was a threat to this military-industrial complex?
Well, there were in the wake of World War II, the U.S. creates this military-industrial complex, and it's a way to solve economic problems and even political problems. And it's a way to solve the dollar gap with Europe and even with Japan as well. It's because they wanted this integrated system where trade and capital flows would go across the Atlantic and across the Pacific with the U.S. in the center, and that was going to be this new global capitalist system over which the U.S. would reign hegemonic. That was the plan. But it ran into problems, especially as Marshall Plan funding was starting to run out. They needed to have some other way to like keep the money flows going, because if there wasn't this economic integration between Europe and the United States, then there was the fear that Europe would become neutral. That's what they were really terrified about, was a neutral Europe that would just do some business with the Soviets and some business with the Americans. And American elites, people like Dean Acheson and the people that worked under him, they wrote NSC 68, 1950. They were really worried about neutrality because they figured then Europe would start to do business with the Russians just as much, and this would be a slide towards communism. But it wouldn't necessarily be a slide towards communism. It doesn't follow that the trade would mean that, they were suddenly going to have these Stalinist regimes. But it really wasn't about so much the character of the governments in Europe. It's not like the communists were going to take over, and that would have been the problem. It would have been a economic alignment that wasn't in the interests of the U.S. and of the U.S. empire. And it's something that we still see today. Look at the way they freak out over the like Nord Stream 2 pipeline, okay, with Russia and Germany. German-Russian relations and German-Russian economic integration is still like a major, preoccupation of U.S. policymakers. So the military-industrial complex arises in the late 40s and early 50s as a result of planning by these people. They come up with the idea in 1950. They really need to rearm America because they had these other war scares and things like that. I think there's a 1948 war scare, and then there's the 1949 Red Scare, and all these things get amplified and exaggerated to boost anti-communist feeling in the United States, just to create the right mentality that they need to prosecute this Cold War. And so with the rise of the rearmament of America, that really it's the ideas put forward in 1950, and then just serendipitously the Korean War breaks out, which is an interesting story in itself. But I have some ideas about this that are interesting, but I want to substantiate them more before I say too much else. But let's just say that like it was exactly what they needed. And this led to the rearmament of America. Winston Churchill even said, "I didn't even know where Korea was on a map until now." But its main consequence of this war is the rearming of America, and that led to this military-industrial complex and this new class of people that benefited from this, often intertwined with oil in places like Texas and the Southwest, California defense contractors, West Coast defense contractors like Boeing is in Washington, right? And then you have these different contractors out in California and so on, and Texas, right? So there's this whole group of people that are right-wingers, and they're even more right-wing than the Council on Foreign Relations. The Council on Foreign Relations was the Rockefeller, Wall Street-centered establishment at the time, sometimes called like the East Coast establishment, and they were responsible for the planning of the U.S. entry into World War II and for the post-war peace. They produced the War and Peace Studies Project during World War II. Even before the U.S. entered, they said, "Yeah, we're going to eventually enter the war. We're going to win. And then we're going to be in a really great position, and we're going to need things like a World Bank and an IMF and a UN." And they really plan all these things before before the U.S. even enters the war. And that's the Council on Foreign Relations. But then you get this more right-wing part, this economic power block that emerges in Texas, in the Southwest, connected to oil and the military-industrial complex that emerges as well. And they had plans for just U.S. dominance everywhere. It was really a question of what was decolonization going to look like? So the U.S. did not want to preside over a colonial empire like Britain, but they wanted to be hegemonic over a global empire that was as big or bigger than what the British actually had. But to do it through, the question is, what was that going to look like? So people that were of a more benevolent, less imperialist, frame of mind, like I believe Franklin Roosevelt fit this description, and his Vice President Henry Wallace, right, from 1940 to 44, and I think John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy wanted this more benevolent vision of America's place in the world. They wanted something, and then on the other side, you had the people who wanted hegemony and basically neocolonialism. So they wanted for decolonization to look like neocolonialism, which is just maintaining the economic relationships of colonialism, but without formal colonial rule. I mean, I'm sure you know that. But so in Vietnam, you had the French had been kicked out of their colony finally. Roosevelt did not want the French to retain their colony in Indochina, but Truman is more amenable to what these sort of Wall Street elites say, and they were not wanting to turn over Vietnam to the Vietnamese. So they put the French back in charge, and the French are supported by Truman and by Eisenhower until they finally lose in 1954. And then they hammer out these agreements in Geneva, and there's supposed to be elections in 1956 to unify the country, but that doesn't work because the U.S. scuttles it. John Foster Dulles and the U.S. basically say, no, we're just going to keep our puppet here, and we're going to rig an election, and so we're going to not have the country unified. So Kennedy inherits that situation, and it was a terrible situation for him to have inherited. The political problems it caused were stemming from the sort of anti-communist Cold War hysteria that the media always kept at a low boil, at least. And so Kennedy did not feel that he could extricate the United States from Vietnam without suffering really serious political consequences. And so he sent more advisors to Vietnam as a way to give a consolation to the generals and the right wing who wanted him to send troops. They made every argument to try to get him to send troops in 1961. On November 22nd, 1961, Kennedy issues INSAM 111, which allows for advisors to be sent and for other, military hardware to be sent, but not ground troops. And that was a line that he held to all throughout his presidency. But this fear of losing Indochina and that causing him political problems was something that impacted his approach to Vietnam. And so, in 1949, the communists win in China, which had been foreseen by some people, but it leads to a Red Scare in the United States, contributes to the McCarthyism in the early 50s. And it was they were saying, who lost China? Okay, it shows an imperialist frame of mind anyway, as though China was ours in the first place. But if you know what was happening in China the last couple hundred years, it's pretty depressing, and they were really dominated by Western powers with better technology and so on. But Kennedy didn't want to be the one who lost Indochina, or at least not until he'd already been reelected. And so he set about orchestrating a way to withdraw that would kick the can down the road until after he was reelected. And at that point, they could declare victory, have a government that called itself neutral, or have a leader in there that would ask them out. And the troop withdrawals were already going on a certain schedule that they'd already put into place. So Kennedy saw, because he'd been to France, he'd been there as a congressman in the early 50s, and he knew that the French were in a terrible situation, and that this was an unwinnable war, and that the Vietnamese would rather die than go back to colonial domination. So he was aware of all of these things, having seen it firsthand, and he had an anti-colonial mindset to begin with because of maybe his Irish background, for the history of the Irish, of course. And he didn't want to get stuck over there, so he had a plan to get out. And unfortunately, he was, let's just say, deceptive in his communication about Vietnam, because he felt that for political reasons, he couldn't really say that the U.S. was not going to win in Vietnam. Although towards the end of his life, in the last press conferences, the ones that took place after the No Dinh Diem coup of early November 1963, Kennedy stopped talking about victory in Vietnam as like a central U.S. objective. So it's possible that he was actually, because of the Diem coup, that he was going to reevaluate that policy and even take a bolder stance about Vietnam. But this is a question that's still unanswerable. And to my knowledge, the JFK library, they had a taping system in the White House to record conversations that the president had with different people, and the transcripts stop around November 7. There's none of them there for at least in the last PDF that I saw, which I had to go to the Internet Archive to find anyway, from 2009. They stopped recording these things. So I have one hypothesis that he was actually going to take a bolder stance on Vietnam, and had a plan to maybe move some of these things up and make it more clear that the U.S. was withdrawing, and start to change his negotiating strategy that way. But at any rate, he was pulling out of Vietnam, and the records that have been declassified now, I think, establish that pretty clearly. I think the only thing that you can argue now is that would he have reversed he could have still reversed his decision to pull out of Vietnam. You can't prove that he wouldn't do that, but he was getting out of Vietnam, and I think that the record shows that, and I think we can thank Oliver Stone for that, because it was the JFK Records Act that came about as a result of his movie, which led to the declassification of these documents that let us now say, oh yeah, Kennedy was withdrawing from Vietnam.
Yeah, his policy of withdrawals obviously is stark contrast to what you mentioned on the documentary about Operation Vulture. The idea of the US offering the French bombers, including possibly dropping nukes in Vietnam, which
I mean, the French were like, well, we thank you, but there was no way that we can do this without nuking our own people. And I'm guessing John Foster was like, "Are you sure?" I mean,
go on, you'll enjoy it.
It's just, I think some of them might survive if you drop it here and not there. I mean, it was madness. But these guys were, John Foster Dulles was kind of insane. I think his brother was more sinister and more calculating, but I think John Foster Dulles at times kind of even went into like kind of messianic, Protestant Cotton Mather mode or something. I don't even know what you call it, but it was that's a ridiculous scene. And at least the people in the Eisenhower administration I think the British also were against it. So the British and the French, thankfully, were like, okay, this is actually not the thing to do.
Yeah, it's strange. The Dulles brothers keep popping up throughout history.
Well, that's the Nazi stuff. The Nazi stuff is wild, and then you think about it, it's like the threads are there because they were. He was a Standard Oil lawyer. Alan Dulles was, and represented them in like Indonesia, for example, when they were trying to get in there. At one point, they kind of entertained, apparently, the idea that there might be a coup, a pro-Nazi coup in the Dutch East Indies, and that they could actually live with that. That was one thing. And then I think Roosevelt had different plans. But they were still doing business with like IG Farben. John Foster Dulles was representing IG Farben's U.S. subsidiary for things dealing with trading with the enemy. Alan Dulles was caught up in this scandal of like Humble Oil selling oil to Vichy France. This was a problem for Standard Oil also. And then he helps to get those Nazis out. With Operation Sunrise, that early surrender of like Karl Wolff and other people in Italy, that was totally illegal or against the orders of kind of treasonous, I guess, because it violated Roosevelt's orders. Then Operation Paperclip to get all those Nazis out. And they used these guys in the Cold War, like, Otto Skorzeny and Klaus Barbie, these guys they use in covert operations, Werner von Braun, the rocket scientist. Yeah. And another part of it is this Thomas McKittrick fellow who is connected to the Bank for International Settlements, an American banker. And I think that Roosevelt wanted to go after those people after the war and really wanted to take out like that Dulles, McKittrick, Bank for International Settlements clique of people who were friendly with the Nazis. And so, but they weren't able to. And after the war, it seems like you can say that really that side prevails in the U.S. establishment, and they really set up a kind of covert fascism in the United States in the pursuit of empire. And Dulles and the Nazi angle, he can't just be like written off as like incidental. I mean, I think it's a big part of this, of the DNA of this American empire, is that there's a Nazi element in it.
Yeah, I mean, the first episode I did of the show was actually involved their possible involvement in getting Hitler out of Berlin in 1945. If you've ever gone down that rabbit hole before.
No, I haven't. I have no idea what to make of any of that. I think Hitler would have been so radioactive that it would have been more trouble to try to keep him. I think like his spirit lives on in Otto Skorzeny and other people that Alan Dulles was probably cool with.
Yeah, possibly. So there was obviously a desperation to get involved in Vietnam, emanating from dark forces. The trigger point being the Gulf of Tonkin incident, ultimately, has since been raised as a false flag. The idea of false flags is interesting, of course, because of Operation Northwoods' plan, which was rejected outright by President Kennedy in regards to Cuba. What was his relationship with Castro like? And why, given that Oswald had tangible but disputable links to communism, the Soviets, and Cuba, why wasn't the JFK assassination used as a pretext for Cuban invasion as outlined in Operation Northwoods?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a lot of mysteries that linger about the operational aspect and the potential Cuban angle there. So I can talk about that in a second. As far as Kennedy's relationship with Castro, he got elected in part by being a little more aggressive in the debates with Nixon over Cuba. I think in this way, Kennedy, it was unfortunate in a way because it kind of made it more imperative upon Kennedy to be. Um, it was more of an imperative that he maintain an aggressive stance towards Cuba as president. But he launches. I think that the embargo officially actually takes off or is begun under Kennedy. Well, I think that there were different steps taken up until Kennedy was president because it happens toward the end of Eisenhower's administration. I think, if I recall correctly, the embargo actually begins under Kennedy, but I might have the year wrong on that, 60 or 61. But he launches Operation Mongoose against Castro, and this is, some John Newman says that this is the worst decision of Kennedy's presidency. I think that's probably correct. Kind of a terror campaign and so on, and different sort of propaganda operations and everything, and little raids against Cuba. It's hard to say what Kennedy kind of knew that these were mostly symbolic, and the CIA people thought, yeah, these are just pinpricks. These aren't really doing anything, right? But they were still giving a space for this kind of terror, state terror to be directed against the Cubans. And the assassination attempts, to my knowledge, were never approved by Kennedy. And there's a Inspector General report on this after Kennedy was assassinated about this subject as to whether they were authorized. The CIA's own Inspector General said that there was no, in this case, the CIA was acting without presidential authorization. And I believe that is the case because knowing the Kennedy brothers, especially Robert Kennedy as Attorney General, the way that he went after organized crime, I do not think that he ever would have accepted working with these elements to try to assassinate a foreign leader. So Kennedy also, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he refuses to send troops, he refuses to bomb Cuba and start a full-on war against the advice of all of his generals and the majority of the people advising him. They're able to work out a peaceful solution to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And of course, I don't even mention this, but I should just to say it. The Bay of Pigs operation, which began planning for it under Nixon, Kennedy under Eisenhower, but Nixon was the point man as vice president. Under JFK, he's advised that this is going to be successful. This operation with these Cuban exiles, they're going to land on the beach, and it's going to be great. And the people are going to rise up, and then we can help them. And so Kennedy said, "Okay, but I'm not going to, launch a unilateral invasion. If the Bay of Pigs, if the exiles fail, then I'm not going to send in the military. It would be too much of a loss of American prestige. I'm just not going to do it." Now, the people like Allen Dulles and the Joint Chiefs knew that the operation wasn't going to succeed, but they persuaded Kennedy to launch it anyway with the idea that they would be able to, when it came down to it, persuade him to send in the U.S. military rather than accept failure. But Kennedy had a lot more spine than these people had anticipated, and he accepted defeat there and went on TV and said, "There's a saying that victory has 1,000 fathers and defeat is an orphan. Well, I own this defeat. I'm the responsible officer of the government," and so on. So this already upset the CIA people and the national security state people right off the bat with Kennedy. And so you get to the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, and he again resists pressure to invade Cuba and take out those nukes and whatever, which is good because it turns out that there were already Soviet tactical nuclear weapons on the island, and they would have used them in the event of a U.S. invasion, and it would have started World War III, potentially, ending life on Earth. Who knows? Thankfully, Kennedy didn't listen to his advisors, but they really hated him for that up until the end of his presidency. And after this, Kennedy becomes even more aware of the fact that he needs to rein in this national security state and this war machine. And so he begins back channel negotiations with people like Castro and Khrushchev. With Castro, it's talking about potentially putting out feelers for normalizing relations and so on. Détente with the Soviet Union, ending the Cold War. They were already taking steps in that direction. Kennedy gave his peace speech. So it seemed like the Cuban business was of a piece with this. And when Kennedy is killed, there's actually a person there who's serving as a back channel to Castro, between Castro and Kennedy, named Jean Daniel. And they get the news that Kennedy has been shot. And Castro's reaction is, this is really bad news. This is bad news. Everything has changed. And Castro knew what happened right away. I mean, give Castro credit. He went on Cuban radio in the days afterwards, and he said, "Who is this guy, Oswald? He looks like a communist, but he's really not. So of course they're going to try to blame this on us. But it's really just the right wing of the American capitalist class refusing to accept Kennedy's, changes to foreign policy. Like Kennedy wanted a more reasonable approach, and these guys would not have it. And this is how it is in this capitalist, empire to our north." So he even made references to how ridiculously suspicious it was that this supposed communist who says he's not a communist, who says he's like a patsy, then gets killed by some strange nightclub owner, and how ridiculous that was. So Castro knew right away. Which is, it's comical for people who are observing history now to think about that.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps those forces were decided that Vietnam was the more profitable war to be had instead of the smaller Cuba, I would guess. I mean, since there is documented evidence, of course, that the CIA was trying to get to Castro, and almost from Kennedy's first day in office, he had to deal with political assassinations with the Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba of the Republic of Congo. You have his name escapes me. The United States Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld. I mean, there's evidence. Well, I say evidence. There's queries about that plane crash, whether that was
it seems pretty like there's a pretty mainstream historian, Susan Williams. She's either a mainstream historian or a mainstream journalist, and she wrote the book Who Killed Dag Hammarskjöld, and it led to them reopening the investigation. It actually seems that pretty clear that he was assassinated, and the questions that are more interesting now, I mean, I don't think they'll never get to the details of who did it and who ordered it, because that's just the way these things, it's been a long time, and plus I think a lot of these things are done orally anyway, they don't, and so
they tend to write it down, do they?
No, I mean, this is another area where like mainstream liberals and so on and historians are kind of strategically stupid about these things, about state secrecy. They don't want to get into it, but the really fascinating thing is it's written about in this book here, JFK versus Allen Dulles, the Greg Polgrain book. That Polgrain for decades went and interviewed everybody connected to Indonesia in 1965 in Sukarno's overthrow. And one of these people that he talked to was Dag Hammarskjöld's right-hand man. And he told Polgrain that Hammarskjöld had a plan the month that he was going to come back from the Congo to get at the UN to announce that this UNEX, I don't know exactly what it stands for, but it was abbreviated and shortened as like UNEX, UNEX, was going to act as a custodian of sorts for West Papua and allow eventually the Papuan people to have sovereignty over that island, over their territory, instead of the Dutch and the Indonesians, who both wanted it. The Dutch traditionally had the Dutch East Indies, and that was sort of the eastern outskirts of that, right? But it's a huge island, it's huge territory. And then the Indonesian Sukarno wanted it too, but Kennedy didn't want to upset an important Cold War person, Sukarno, who's pivotal, and he's neutral, but he could be brought on to at least be neutral and or on the U.S. in the U.S. side, and he didn't want to upset the Dutch also by giving the island to the Indonesians, because the Dutch are a NATO ally, and so it was going to be he was going to use Dag Hammarskjöld in the UN as a stalking horse to allow the Papuan people to take control of that island and that territory. That's that western half of the island. But Allen Dulles knew, because he set up a shell corporation in 1935 called Netherlands New Guinea Petroleum Company, something like that, and it was 60% American and 40% Dutch. He was able to get the Dutch to negotiate that because they were worried about the Japanese Imperial, Navy coming in, right? So the Dutch actually allowed the U.S. to have a controlling interest there. And in 1936, this company that Allen Dulles, acting as a Standard Oil, Rockefeller lawyer for Sullivan and Cromwell, he set up this company. This company and the Dutch send an expedition to try to climb the highest point in West Papua and see what they can find. And it's a way to sort of give them more legitimacy to claim sovereignty over that island, so that they can say that they actually have a presence there, because it was really sparsely populated, not even really colonized that much, because it was so remote, So anyway, they send this expedition out there. These three guys, one of them's name is Dozy, a geologist for the company, and he discovers the biggest gold deposit in human history. It's the Freeport mine. And they don't tell anyone about it. They actually put out a report about it 3 years later, and they sort of deceptively write about it using sort of discrepancies between Dutch and English understandings of grains versus grams of gold, per ton. And this stays secret for all through the 40s and the 50s. And only a few people know about it. Only a few Dutch high officials, and then the this Rockefeller company that Dulles had set up. So Allen Dulles as well knew about this. And Kennedy never knew about this at all, and neither did Dag Hammarskjöld, and neither did Sukarno. They didn't know that they had this huge resource bonanza over there. And so the argument that Polgrain puts forward, the professor that wrote the Australian history professor who wrote this book, is that, I think the inference is that, this is probably why Dag Hammarskjöld was killed. People thought it was about the Congo, and that it may have been like Kennedy, kind of overdetermined, like his anti-colonial his anti-colonial beliefs and ideals were going to run into they were going to mess with the plans of people like Dulles and these corporate U.S. imperialists. So he may have been killed for a number of reasons, but I think it's pretty persuasive that this had to have been the biggest reason. This gold mine, it's the biggest gold mine in history, and it gets immediately after Sukarno gets overthrown in 1965, which is also something Kennedy didn't want. The Freeport people are on the ground within a year, and that Freeport is this Rockefeller company, and they've been mining this place. One of the people said that there's enough gold there to be mined for another 300 years. It's not, they don't even know how much gold they've taken out of there. So I would guess this is part of what happened. This is really the motive for killing Hammarskjöld, and probably a big part of the motive for killing Kennedy as well, because he was going to visit Indonesia in 1964, and they were going to resolve these conflicts that Sukarno was having with Malaysia. It was called Konfrontasi, and Dean Rusk confirmed that, Kennedy was definitely going to resolve that. That was why he was headed over there in 1964. Of course, he doesn't live to see 1964. So a lot of these things have to do with colonialism in a way that the Cold War was just a cover for neocolonialism and a way for the U.S. to reestablish dominance and exploitation and expropriation over formerly colonized peoples that whose countries occupy a large part of the Earth's surface.
Yeah, Hammarskjöld is one of certainly many questionable deaths in the 60s. You've got both Kennedys, obviously, Marilyn Monroe, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, even going down the rabbit hole of President Diem's death in Vietnam.
Well, he was definitely assassinated as a result of a coup, but it's hard to say what exactly. It is still mysterious as to why that happened the way that it did. I don't think that Kennedy wanted that to go forward. He seemed very pissed when the initial cable went out, and he definitely didn't want him assassinated. So that's another one. Thomas Merton gets assassinated in 1968. That's another one that people. I'm not too familiar with the details of it, but given that it was 1968 and what I have heard about it, it seems plausible that he was also assassinated. He was a very eloquent voice for peace, and it's just like, come on, RFK, MLK, and Thomas Merton all die in the same year under kind of inexplicable circumstances. It's like, of course,
it gets a bit obvious after a while. Once the numbers start racking up, it's always, oh, what a terrible accident, or oh, what another lone nut has come along and decided he doesn't like somebody. It's like I guess you did have Reagan got shot, but even when Reagan got shot, George H.W. Bush was the vice president, and he was scheduled to have his son was scheduled to have dinner with the father of the guy that shot Reagan. Like within days of that whole event. Like, it's a very weird thing. So it's like, never the people
even when it's a right winger. Yeah, even when it's a right winger, there's some other weird circumstances where it's like there's still some other right winger who seems to be involved, like Bush.
Yeah, it's strange. One thing I found particularly striking about the Destiny Betrayed documentary was the mention of Israel. I'm currently reading the James Douglas book, JFK and the Unspeakable, that you mentioned earlier. It's a comprehensive look into the foreign policy of JFK at the time, yet Israel isn't mentioned once, which is curious. I mean, it's of course.
I think he does mention it. He does mention it. I think. If you haven't read it,
it's not in the index.
It may not be in the index. I think he mentions. I don't know why I remember this. I hope I'm not misremembering it. I think in that book at one point he mentions that Angleton also handled the Israeli desk, and I think that he also mentions Dimona. The Dimona nuclear reactor, and that Kennedy had a different approach to it. So he does. If it's not in the index, that's interesting. I would have guessed it was in the index, but I think he does mention it a couple points.
I've not finished reading the book yet, so it could well be there.
Okay. Well, afterwards, you got to email me and tell me if I was right in remembering that or not, because I'm curious myself.
But obviously, it's an emotive topic. Hence, it was interesting to see Stone's documentary bringing to light Kennedy's relationship with Israel, particularly with the push to go nuclear. What's your interpretation of the link there? Because I believe there was pushback from Israel about weapons nuclear inspection going on.
Yeah, they had that Dimona nuclear reactor, right, which is what eventually they end up getting the bomb from. And Jim DiEugenio actually has a really good article over at Kennedy's and King on Kennedy's changes in policy. I think he wrote one. Did he write it for Covert Action Magazine? I don't know, but Jim DiEugenio has written a really good article on this. Basically, all throughout the Middle East, Kennedy didn't like the Acheson Dulles, sort of imperial general framework that they had set over there. Kennedy really didn't like the Shah, was kind of disgusted by the Shah and the Saudi royals both, and those were pillars of the U.S. presence over there. And with Israel, I think he was the guy who was the most favorably disposed to the Palestinians. He wanted the Palestinians to be able to come back, to be compensated and or given their homes back to the extent possible. He was also friendly to Nasser, who under Eisenhower, the U.S. and the Brits had tried to use, like the Muslim Brotherhood and CIA and MI6 to assassinate Nasser. Kennedy actually made friendly gestures towards Nasser. And in Iran, he even looked into potentially having some Mossadegists, people who had been loyal to Mossadegh was really old by this point. He was really old even when he was president, when he was prime minister. But he wanted to explore potentially having them return to some sort of democracy with these liberal reformer types, like that were in the vein of Mossadegh and being in charge. So with Israel, I think that there's this element of the U.S. empire that's been like a beachhead in a way for like Anglo-British, Anglo-American imperialism. And it's the Jewish aspect of it is kind of a useful prop in a way, and it kind of insulates Israel from being held more accountable for its policies towards the Palestinians and towards its neighbors. I mean, Israel just like bombs Syria whenever they feel like it. This is another thing that goes on. They just are kind of America is gangsterish in the way that it goes around bombing countries whenever it wants, but Israel on a small scale just is totally gangsterish in the Middle East, and they have nukes, so it's not like they can be invaded by somebody, but they're still going out and bombing people. And it's in a way that, like, you see that the U.S., Saudi, Israeli kind of imperial core over there is, you got to think of it as a largely connected, coherent entity. And so, Kennedy I think Kennedy favored kind of self-determination for people, including people in the Middle East. And so he didn't really have a use for the despotism of the Israeli, Saudi, Iranian regimes. And who knows? I think that it would look a lot different today if Kennedy hadn't been killed. It's another reason why you can see why I would say his death was really overdetermined, because the things he was trying in all these regions would have set these places on very different trajectories than what did actually happen.
Yeah, absolutely. You had an interesting podcast that I've just finished listening to about propaganda in Hollywood. One interesting link I found with the JFK film was one of the executive producers, Arnon Milchan, was actually Mossad.
Yeah, I've heard that too. Yeah, no, I looked at that. I think I've talked about that. I don't know if I ever talked about that to Oliver, but I've looked at that and tried to figure out what the hell that's about. And I really have there are different hypotheses. Like, okay, so the guy was a Hollywood producer for one thing. So, and that movie made a lot of money. So for him, that's a job well done, right? So, like, there's reasons he could have just been doing it purely as a producer who produces movies, because that is his occupation. Okay. I mean, because it was super successful that way. And if so, he did a great thing from that perspective. Now, would Mossad have had any, this is just a question. I've never really tried to write about this or really hash out what I think about it too much, but like, would Mossad have had any reason, the Israeli intelligence have any reason to like put this kind of film out there? It's 1991. Bush is the president. H.W. Bush had at some points taken sort of independent, I mean, I don't want to say even-handed, but a little bit in that direction, at some points towards the Israelis, not always giving them everything that they wanted. So the only angle that I can see as for his intelligence status being somehow relevant to the production of that movie, because I think the funding for that movie came from France and England. It came from Europe, as I understand it. Would have been, is this a way for some elements of the pro-Israel establishment to be able to say, hey, America, we might have some things that could embarrass your, establishment in some way, related to the Kennedy assassination?
The thing that I saw, it went down a link of Clay Shaw being on the board of a company called Permandex, which had CIA, mafia, and Mossad people involved, so that essentially they were outsourcing the assassins to people with essentially the same interests. And the whole point of Milchan's involvement was to keep Permandex and Clay Shaw in the film separate, and therefore you wouldn't go down the route of any Mossad involvement.
Yeah, I have my understanding of the Permandex thing, which is kind of complicated, but Clay Shaw, and he was connected to that, and this is something people have argued about a lot. Jim D'Eugenio writes about his connections to Permandex. I don't know that it's been established that there's like this real clear connection between Shaw and Permandex and like Israel, and whether there were Israeli elements or not, I wouldn't be surprised if there were, but like it was connected to Schroeder Bank, which is kind of a Nazi bank. I mean, I think that there are connections between Permandex and Schroeder Bank, which is connected to Allen Dulles. It was a way that one of his sort of old semi-Nazi friendly connections that he had as another conduit for clandestine funding for things. So I haven't seen anything that says that it's like Israel, that there was that he influenced this in a Israel friendly way. I always like, there's a book on this by like some guy named Piper or something, and he tries to make the case that it's like, oh, the assassination was this Israel thing, and that's where I think like that's just, I don't really believe that. I think Israel does at times manipulate comes to manipulate U.S. politics. Like there's always these spy scandals and things, and there's the Israel lobby in the United States, which Walt and Mearsheimer have documented really well. But I think
that the FARA Act by any chance?
They what?
I believe it was the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which was, I think.
Oh yeah, they're kind of exempt from that. Israel's exempt from that to some degree or something. Are they, or is that, am I misremembering that?
I think that could be correct. Kennedy was trying to change that literally 3 days before his assassination. I think, like you say, I don't think it, like, certainly Israel and Mossad aren't like the driving force, but it's whether or not they have the same interests in the outcome that a lot of.
Yeah, I mean, but you could say that about these. I mean,
loads of people.
Yeah, and that's just it. Like when one of the guys that I think was credible, who died, who was killed in a really mysterious way, Gary Underhill, and he said, "Oh, it was these Far East. You know, I came to find out that these Far East CIA guys went and killed the president. This is madness, right?" So I think he's referring to some of these like people over in connected to the Kunming base in China, which had been an OSS base, and then they set up camp outside in like Burma, and with the KMT in Taiwan, people involved in heroin traffic, like Sea Supply, which was a CIA proprietary, and like what became Civil Air Transport or Air America, all these other shady operations over there, the World Anti-Communist League, or like the Asian People's Anti-Communist League with like Yoshio Kodama, who was a Yakuza guy, but then later a CIA asset in Japan, that there were all these hard right-wing elements connected to organized crime in East Asia. But then you also have these all these Cubans that are involved in the assassination. Lyndon Johnson says, yeah, we were running a damn Murder Incorporated down there, right? So you have like Lansdale, who'd been running. Lansdale was a Far East guy in a way because he'd been in Vietnam and the Philippines, but then he's running Operation Mongoose. So he apparently has those, I mean, according to Joan Mellon, he was the person running the assassination part of Mongoose without Kennedy's approval. People believe that he was in Dealey Plaza on that day, and he was an acolyte of Dulles. He did retire right before the assassination. John Newman tracked him to Fort Worth like a couple days before the assassination itself. And he had sent Fletcher Prouty to Antarctica, I guess, right before he retired, right? So Fletcher Prouty, as depicted in the movie JFK with Donald Sutherland, he's talking about how he had been sent down to Antarctica, and when he would normally have been responsible for providing security for the president when he went to Dallas. So, and then you have people like from Europe, like there was a French person like Jean-Paul Sartre or something like that.
Isn't that a philosopher or something?
No, that's Sartre. This other guy's name. So like Soutre, I think is how you spell the guy's name. It might not be Jean-Paul though. I might be actually confusing him with Sartre or whatever. But at any rate, there seems to have been some French Corsican elements there, perhaps connected to the OAS that tried to kill de Gaulle, which seemed connected to Gladio elements, people like Otto Skorzeny. I had a friend send a document that a friend of his had found in the West German intelligence archives that spoke about a Air Force general visiting Otto Skorzeny, the sort of Nazi, hitman, covert operations guy, that he had been visiting Otto Skorzeny in 1962, complaining about Kennedy and saying how bad he was and how he was basically giving everything up to the East, meaning like China and Russia, what a disaster he was. So you can see the European, but there's elements of, and Bill Harvey was stationed in Rome as a CIA guy, and he's a guy that people figure into the assassination oftentimes. The other guy Kennedy fired, Lemnitzer, was basically demoted from Joint Chiefs of Staff chairman to NATO, Supreme Commander. So he was in Brussels, presumably in charge of all those Gladio things. So, like I wouldn't be surprised if there were elements of all these things. And then, you know, were any of these that same elements intertwined with like things in the Middle East? Quite possibly. It's like, but any sort of thing that's like puts Israel in a prominent role in all this, I'd be very skeptical of, and I would think it's perhaps a function of you know, wanting to blame Israel and, you know, Jews for things. I know you're not putting that forward, but like any sort of Jews did it.
Not.
Any sort of Jews did it.
Conversation.
Right. But like, you know, it's definitely the case that like Israel is a pillar of U.S. imperial gangsterism around in a very important part of the world. You look on the map in the Mediterranean where it is, and you're like, oh, okay, you're just going to set up this camp there, this beachhead for like Western imperialism. And that was the British idea, and you know, then the U.S. took it and turned it into this like little tiny colossus in the region, and it's, you know, it's a pillar of like horrible stuff that the U.S. has been doing, you know, for decades and decades.
Yeah. So Jim Garrison, who was obviously the subject of and involved in Oliver Stone's JFK movie, he said he didn't want there to be any flying saucers in the film, e.g. things that didn't come with enough evidence. I mean, I've seen some amount of different theories and rabbit holes since I became interested in this. I'm sure you're the same. I mean, are there any aspects of this that you have a, for lack of a better phrase, a guilty pleasure in, regardless of any like tangible evidence?
I mean, there are things to think about that you can really wonder, like, what was the purpose of this? And I mean, like Fletcher, like there's the umbrella guy, you know, that's that way.
Wasn't that a protest for something?
That's what they say, but that's really a dubious thing. It's not. I don't think that that's plausible. I think that guy was probably a person who was there to signal whether it was like, shoot him or don't. It seems to be like that was what it was, because the person that they didn't have any person ID'd for it, and then when they did, it was somebody that seemed connected to one of those military firms down there in some way, shape, or form. And he said he was doing it to like mock John Kennedy's father, Joseph Kennedy, for his having supported Chamberlain, who had an umbrella. I mean, it's very strange. So like, what was that really about? Fletcher Prouty tried to say at one point, like, hey, a guy came into my office with this umbrella, this umbrella that shoots darts, and maybe Kennedy was hit with some sort of dart. I don't believe that is the case, but it's interesting that he saw that. And I just read something or heard it on some sort of new interview with a historian or something, where a guy during the Cold War was actually killed with a dart gun from an umbrella. So that's nutty, but I don't think I don't think that that's what the umbrella guy was. I think the umbrella guy was there as a spotter of some kind, like on the scene, or as a guy giving a green light to the shooters. So that part is fascinating. And some of the thinking about the munitions, like, was Mitch Verbel, the CIA's weapons guru, was he like involved in some of the munitions there? Because it seems like Kennedy was hit with some kind of fragmentary munition that really, when the bullet hit him, it fragmented in such a way as to like blow out the back of his head in a pretty grisly, spectacular way. So those kind of angles. But, you know, I think that and I do wonder myself, like, what was there a plan? You alluded to this earlier, like, why wasn't this used as a pretext to go into Cuba? Was that a part of what was really going on? Was Oswald really supposed to be killed in the theater? And could that have served as a pretext for the Cubans? Were the Cubans that were working there on this, that were involved in this, were they told that this was going to potentially allow for a Cuban invasion? You know, were they kind of like deceived in this way or manipulated in some way? I think they would have followed orders regardless, but like these are things that would be really interesting to know.
Yeah.
Have you been
to? No, of course. Well, maybe another 75 years, but I presume you've been to Dealey Plaza, have you?
No, I've only been to Texas once, and that's my mom lives there, and I may go again at some point. My mom and my sister are there, but I've only been to Austin. I haven't been to Dallas.
Okay. I went a couple of years back. One thing I found remarkable about Dealey Plaza is how small it actually is. Like, you kind of get the impression that it's a really large area and that it'd be really difficult to shoot a guy, but it would it would be remarkably easy. The distances we're talking are so short.
But not easy from the 6th floor, though.
Well, yeah, exactly, which makes you wonder.
That's what I've heard from people that have been there, is that when you go there, you're like, oh yeah, that's the spot behind the fence that would be the place.
Well, I think it was the storm drain, but
people have said that. I've heard that too. I don't know. I mean, but either way, that's a similar. Either way, it's a similar position. I mean, in terms of like distance and so on. But people have, like, Cyril Wecht believes that Kennedy got hit with 2 shots at about the same time. For what it's worth, in the head. So I don't know. I don't really know what to make that. I'm not really the big medical ballistics evidence person. I mean, I know enough to say that, like, okay, the magic bullet theory is impossible. Like, it's absolutely impossible, and it's so impossible that the fact that it was foisted on us is basically proof itself that it was a state crime, because only if the state is putting this as the narrative, then the state is guilty of something. And so it must be a state crime. Like, you can basically almost explain that to somebody in like 5 minutes. And if they're objective about it, then they'll say, like, yeah, this must be a state crime.
Yeah, I mean, that leads quite nicely into what I was about to say, which is, like, it seems prior to the Kennedy assassination, there was one truth, or at least one source of truth in history, and one unquestionable narrative. I mean, it's as though that event opened a can of psychological worms, which has morphed through the subsequent generations now to the point where nobody really knows the truth on anything or where to find it. I mean, weirdly, it seems like that atmosphere has been intentionally fostered at times, like a constant state of confusion, like a black hole that we don't even know whether we should dig in or climb out of. Do you see the JFK assassination as a gateway to other questionable events, like a lens to see the bigger picture of what's really happening?
I think it represented some sort of horrible, spectacular crucible that the fascist core of the state, decided to go forward with. I think that the existence of capitalism and democracy, the coexistence, is naturally, there's a natural tension there, in that capitalism is an economic system that empowers a tiny minority necessarily, and democracy allows for rule of the public, the majority. And so there has to be a big conflict there. And this empire, this lawless empire that the U.S. created, because there's no lawful empire. You really can't have, if the U.S. adhered to international law and domestic law, even, you couldn't have this empire, because so much of it depends on violating the law. Like, all these coups that the U.S. does are against U.S. law. They're actually not. It's not just that it's international law, but international law doesn't matter. Like, the U.S. ratified the UN Charter, which, according to the United States Constitution, makes it the supreme law of the land. The UN Charter explicitly outlaws aggression without Security Council approval, or even the threat of aggression. So it would also outlaw coups. And according to the Constitution, this is like the highest law in the land. Okay, so the U.S. couldn't exist as a lawful empire. So they basically institutionalized lawlessness because they went for global hegemony after World War II. And in order to maintain the pretense, they create this clandestine apparatus so that you can have crimes committed under the cover of a cover story that allows plausible deniability. Okay, so then something happens, it gets reported in the news as according to what the cover story is that the intelligence agencies in the state have contrived, and then that gets reported as news. So that's like fake news, when everybody's freaking out about fake news and misinformation. But like, this has been a core of the regime, especially since World War II, since the end of World War II. And so today's fake news put out by the state becomes tomorrow's fake history. And this is the conundrum that academics and thinkers are dealing with. It's why academia can't really, in the US, liberal political science and history can't grapple effectively with the true nature of the things that it's supposed to be studying, because of the clandestine arts and the way that they are intertwined with all of these institutions that bestow prestige and occupational, compensation to. So it does mark a point at which the truth became something kind of unknowable. I think there was already this growing amount of secrecy and lawlessness. It's just that it was kept below the surface or overseas. This is why Malcolm X, when Kennedy gets killed, he says, "Americans' chickens come home to roost." Okay. And people ask it, and he got in trouble with that from Elijah Muhammad. Although Elijah Muhammad had different motivations for going after Malcolm X for this. But Malcolm X was later asked, "What did you mean by that?" And he said, well, Malcolm X was a genius, by the way. He's like, it's worth going back and listening to his like things they have things from him on YouTube that you can listen to. And he's actually very funny. Even I would disagree with some of his more harsh assessments of white people, carte blanche, but like he kind of mellows out a little bit later. But most of his critiques about the U.S. and the U.S. empire are dead on. And he says, well, I was a farm boy, because he was born in Nebraska. He says, I was a farm boy, and we had chickens, and in the day, your chickens, they might go out to other people's farms, who knows, but at night they come back to roost, and it's always your chickens. Your chickens always come back to roost at your farm. Other people's chickens go back to roost at their farm. So these chickens that America is sending out today, people didn't want to hear this, but they come home to roost. So I think that Malcolm X was dead on and very clever about the way that he said it. And this was happening. This was chickens coming home to roost. And this is just something that Americans don't want to face. So Malcolm X was thought of as being, oh, he said that. That's so, how could he say that? And then after 9/11, Ward Churchill said something similar. And he was also rendered, anathema. I think he was a tenured professor, and I think they eventually fired him for saying that. But the more that comes out about 9/11, you're like, oh yeah, these jihadis. It wasn't just the Mujahideen. It was like all through the 90s they used them. And it's like this. So many key things in our history we really have a mistaken impression of, or we don't know, and we probably are wrong. So like the oil shocks, people think the oil shocks in the 70s were like because of these uppity sheiks, and so on. But it emerges that the U.S. was behind that, and that ended up really shoring up the dollar after Bretton Woods collapsed because of Vietnam. Jimmy Carter's, the inflation and oil shocks that really harmed Jimmy Carter. These seem to have been brought on by these higher powers in in finance and oil. And this paved the way for Reagan, and I think the victory of Reagan is really the consolidation of this deep state regime that basically exercised all of the sort of progressive liberal strains of the American political system. So, the outcome of like Vietnam, Watergate, the Church Committee investigations into the intelligence committees, all that, it would seem like the right should have been discredited, but because they were able to exert power covertly in different ways, or obliquely or opaquely, because of their control over economic things like interest rates and oil prices and so on, they were able to really to shift things to the right. Even after Watergate, you would think like, okay, this, Nixon's this anti-communist, pro-war guy. We're going to get rid of him and scandal, and the intelligence community is also going to be investigated afterwards. Surely America is going to be more open and progressive after this, right? But that's not what happens. So why doesn't that happen? It's like, because the history-making power has migrated, from visible to increasingly invisible circles. It's not like it was ever fully transparent, but the rise of sort of deep governance or parapolitical governance in the United States, governance where actions are taken and responsibility is obscured or hidden. This is more and more the norm, and Americans are perpetually in a state of not knowing, what the reality is, because they need to be kept that way, because the U.S. is not just, a country that has to organize itself to do, the things that the country needs to do and have a functional society. Like it's a society that's managed because in a particular way, because it needs to be agreeable to the maintenance of this huge empire. And even to look into this area and study it with this frame of mind, it's very challenging for somebody who does that full time to even feel that they have a total handle on it or a very strong handle on it, because you're very limited in what you actually know under this system. But like for the average person who just wants to have a normal life and work a job and enjoy things as much as they can until they shovel off this mortal coil, how can they be expected to like follow this kind of thing? It is. So the assassination does mark a key point in this evolution of the regime that we're dealing with now.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Like the average person, certainly. I mean, I obviously don't do this for a job. I dip in and out of different topics as a hobby almost, because I don't know how you manage personally, but like it gets overwhelming. Just the fact that if this becomes your truth and your reality, then it's pretty bleak, pretty bleak world vision, unfortunately. But if that's what more represents the truth, it's one you have to accept almost. I mean, everything you just said there, is that essentially what the outline of your book is going to be? Is there going to be elements of 9/11, the Trump presidency, etc.?
I don't talk about 9/11 a whole lot. I do talk about the U.S. using jihadis. I have written about 9/11 in 4 articles more or less, with Peter Dale Scott, and 3 of them were with Ben Howard also. And so we did those over at Covert Action, and they deal with especially with the U.S. use of jihadis. That's what I write about. I wrote more about part 1 of that series about the U.S. using jihadis all over Central Asia and the Balkans after the Cold War ended. So all throughout the 90s leading up to 9/11, and even back further with the Muslim Brotherhood created by the British Empire, which people don't realize. It was like in order to act as a terrorist, paramilitary terrorist element to get rid of people who were nationalists or socialists. Like that was the actual purpose of it. And the U.S. uses these kind of people to try to, they're involved in the coup to overthrow Iranian democracy in 1953. They use them to try to kill Sukarno. They use these Islamist fanatics to try to throw grenades at Sukarno and kill him in other places in Indonesia. Like this is just this really long history of it, to where like once you get that, it's hard to take seriously the conventional narrative of 9/11, where it's like, oh, we were so surprised that these people don't like us. It's because they have a medieval view and a distortion of Islam, which we obviously really like Islam, but these people are getting it wrong. And then you look back at what the U.S. has been doing, and it's like they're connected to all of these elements. And 9/11, okay, they turn against us for some reason, but they in so doing allow us to do everything we wanted to do following 9/11. So it's really this catastrophic winning of the lottery or something for these guys, right? And then okay, so whatever, let's just set that aside. And then under Obama, we start using these same jihadis again in Libya and Syria, and people just like, oh well, this is normal, I mean, it's this, but when you say it's like heavy, and it is heavy, it can be overwhelming sometimes. Just some people are constitutionally like just kind of drawn to this, and like I would definitely be that way. But it also, the tide of history, the sort of, I see bigger historical forces working that are going to mark the end of this this particular power configuration that the U.S. is the head of. And it's scary because they have nuclear weapons, and is the U.S. potentially, is the U.S. capable of launching a nuclear war that could like wipe out human civilization because of this or that gambit that they pursue to try to hold on to their empire? Because the U.S. has been failing. I mean, we had to withdraw from Afghanistan, the Iraq war. We're in Iraq, but they don't want us there. The parliament asked us to leave. ISIS emerged to give the U.S. an excuse to stick around longer and to occupy Syria, which is also quite interesting. What the hell is ISIS? And, why again do they seem to be Why is the net effect of ISIS so in alignment with like U.S. foreign policy wishes, in terms of what they actually allow? Like the Iraqi parliament wanted the U.S. to leave. Then ISIS emerges out of nowhere. I mean, they wanted them to leave completely, right? ISIS emerges, so the U.S. has a bigger presence. And then Iran actually helps Iraq to kill ISIS. Like, we hate Iran, obviously. And then, so if Iran is the bad guys and ISIS is the bad guys, why is Iran attacking ISIS? And why do we kill Soleimani, the guy who was the most effective fighting ISIS, right? So, like, and we're in Syria totally illegally now. Syrians want us to leave. We're supposedly there because of ISIS. But again, why would Syria want the U.S. to leave if that would mean ISIS would be more powerful, right? It's like the places that ISIS is areas that the U.S. has under its control. And then they occasionally kill somebody there, and they say, "Oh, look, we killed this ISIS leader," right? But it's a shit show at this point. And in Kazakhstan, they tried to stage a coup there, and that seems pretty clearly to be the U.S. motive, or the U.S. Plan. I think with help from Turkey as well. It seems, using these jihadi networks. I mean, it's to the point that, like, oh yeah, it's the U.S. because people started chopping off some heads, right? It's like, that's not a peaceful protest of civil society in Kazakhstan. That's like, those are covert operations, and they fit a template. It's very easy to understand, and other people in that part of the world know it. I mean, you can read Russian analysts talking about this. They know the U.S. playbook now. So the U.S. failed there. They supposedly failed in Kyrgyzstan, some coup that I'm not even really that familiar with. They failed there. This Ukraine business is alarming, because what is the U.S. trying to do there? Like, if they start some bigger war, it would be a disaster for everyone. So I think that the tide is going to turn, and that's going to change the calculus for the leaders in the West. And they're going to have to, I hope, reform in some sort of sensible way. The problem is that it seems that to open the door to reforms is to really open the door potentially to some disclosures that would really be pretty mind-blowing for the public, and really damage the legitimacy of these people. I mean, I don't know that they have a plan B for, like, after the empire. And so what are you going to do? What is life going to look like as this happens? Is this going to be a slow decline of the empire, or is there going to be some terrible, like, nuclear disaster that results from this, or what? Are they going to try to impose some kind of more strict fascism in the U.S.? I mean, you see elements of that, more calls for censorship all the time. And I don't know, but I think that the bigger issue that's kind of inescapable is the rise of a multipolar world order. And I don't see that the U.S. can manipulate the American public and the publics of its vassal states, like where you live. I mean, they can mess with us, our publics, all the time, right? I mean, they're on one side. They're all part of this one big empire. But outside of that, they can't dictate reality. They can't just mesmerize the Chinese people and the Russian people and the Iranian people and the Venezuela.
I'm not sure how much you're aware of UK politics, but Scotland's got its own. How best to put this? I would suggest our leader is probably part of the same globalist forces that have taken elements of the US government. She'll happily take pictures with Hillary Clinton. I'll put it.
Oh, yeah, I mean, that's not surprising at all, really. I mean, it's the system, the British Empire. People say, okay, I've tried to make the case that the British represent an example of an empire that was able to peacefully, accept the ending of its empire, right? But I don't really think that that's quite what happened. The British establishment was invited under the U.S. imperial umbrella, and so their investments and so on were protected. They really weren't forced to give up their empire. It was more like their imperial holdings, the capital that they had invested around the world, was going to be protected by the U.S. as the globo cop, right, for capitalism. And so there really is, but that's not, the U.S. doesn't have that option to give something up to a bigger empire. Like China and Russia are basically saying, hey, we should have people observe international law. Americans don't even know that. They don't even understand that, like, what the Chinese and Russians are really asking for is by and large just the observance of international law. The Americans say, no, this is the rules-based international order. Okay, have you ever heard that phrase before? I mean,
possibly, yeah.
From U.S. officials, and then their flacks in the media, right? They'll say, oh, that China and Russia are trying to change the rules-based international order. Well, what the hell does that even mean? What it really means is the order that we have been living under for decades, in which the U.S. can do whatever it wants and violate any laws that it wants, any treaties that it wants, and the rest of the world has to accept it. That's what it really means. It's like a dictatorship, an American dictatorship over the world. And they're saying that, like, they're disrupting the rules-based international order. But it's like the perfect way of euphemizing or really lying with words. I mean, it's Orwellian because it sounds as though the U.S. cares about the rule of law of some kind, but it's the exact opposite. They're really defending a dictatorial regime and denouncing any countries that would try to change that system.
Yeah, well, the plus side of it being the last throes of the empire is that, on the one hand, there are people who are coming more under the spell of the propaganda, but at the same time, there are more and more people who are becoming aware of the ridiculousness of the whole thing and actually pushing back. So when is your book actually due to drop?
It was going to come out in April, and I think they pushed it back to May because of supply chain issues. So when that comes out, I'll probably do a few more, some appearances related to that. And I added some things since the dissertation that I'm really happy about. I think it's a much better read than it was when I wrote it as a doctoral project. So I'm excited for people to read it. I think that the history parts in particular, I'm really happy about. I sort of lay out a history of the American deep state, the going up from basically from the end of World War II to Reagan. But I really go over those things well. The stuff related to the 1970s and Watergate, I thought were really interesting, and I'm excited for people to read it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to read it too. I've got it pre-ordered on Amazon, but it keeps getting pushed back, like you say. So,
yeah.
Where can people find you online and the rest of your work?
The American Exception podcast is on Patreon, and I'm hoping to get a website up soon, which may have some of my other writings put there and some other things related to the podcast. The podcast now is up to about 20 episodes soon. I think it'll be the number 20 comes out, and I have a whole lot of stuff related to JFK, including interviews with people that are in the Oliver Stone documentary, people like David Talbot, John Newman, James Galbraith, Jim D'Eugenio is in a few episodes. Lisa Pease is coming up next. She's great. I've got Oliver Stone and Abby Martin in one, and a lot of stuff with Peter Dale Scott, who is just fabulous, and it's been wonderful to work with him. So I'm really, for people that are interested in this material, this podcast I think has a great collection of thinkers talking about these issues that I obviously think are very important.
Yeah, no, the podcast is absolutely fascinating, of course, and obviously you've had Oliver Stone on there a couple of times. It's very interesting to hear his take on all these things. But anyway, thanks for joining me today. Best of luck with the book release. Hope it goes well for you.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here, and good luck with your podcast here.
Join us next time for the Political Darkside podcast.
It's a disaster. Whose idea was that? It's just ridiculous.
Available on iTunes, Google, and Spotify.
For more information, visit politicaldarkside.com.